Chapter 8. Monday mid-morning. Doreen sighed. Come on, Goliath. Let's go outside. We're in the way. She propped open the door and headed down the steps, hoping that Goliath would choose to follow. It was pretty hard to order that cat to do anything. So far, Goliath did what he wanted. When it lined up with Doreen's wants, they were both happy, but that didn't mean that he would choose to be agreeable today. As she walked down the path toward the creek, Muggs at her side, Thaddeus on her shoulder, Goliath streaked out past her. She chuckled. See? I told you it was a good idea. He just shot her a look that said, whatever. At the creek she stopped and wondered what she was supposed to do now. She was restless. The moving men were doing what they needed to do. And she wanted that to happen, but at the same time, they would be hours. She couldn't just sit and relax. She didn't really feel like gardening, although she should be doing that. Instead, she found her feet, almost as if by rote now, heading toward Penny's house. Doreen groaned as she arrived at the spot where she'd normally cross the creek. We don't always have to go in this direction. You know that, right, guys? Muggs was already trying to cross, but the leash wasn't giving him much leeway. She sighed and said, come on. Let's keep walking beside the creek. And she walked past the crossing spot. Once Muggs realized they were changing direction, he raced eagerly. She just smiled. It was always nice to have company, and these trips were fun for the animals too. She was trying to avoid Penny, and that persistent nudge in the back of Doreen's mind that maybe something wasn't quite right there. But Doreen had no basis for that, and the last thing she wanted to do was look too closely at somebody who could be a friend. Doreen didn't have any friends, and it was a novel idea to find somebody at this time of her life. Her other friends had been deemed appropriate for her lifestyle back then. Her husband had vetted them all, and they were usually trophy wives of businessmen he worked with. She'd thought that was what friendships were. But as soon as she'd gotten involved in that messy divorce, everybody had distanced themselves from her, helping her realize there was really no such thing as friends with that group. Now, even though Penny was that much older, it was still nice to know Doreen had somebody she could maybe go have a cup of tea with outside of her own grandmother. And to be honest, Doreen hadn't had the time or the interest in getting out and socializing with anybody else. She'd been so busy working on these cold cases that she hadn't put any effort into fitting in here. Penny had definitely helped in that regard. In fact, that made Doreen feel very good. Then, of course, her mind zipped to Steve. At least Penny didn't seem to be too perturbed that Doreen had been in Penny's backyard. Which was good, but Doreen felt like she'd pushed the limit there, and now she needed to back away. She walked along the creek, her thoughts scattered as she tried to avoid thinking about what was going on at her house. She needed that furniture gone, and for Scott to give her the names of other antique specialists to contact about the little stuff Doreen wanted to get rid of as well. Speaking of the little stuff, she still had to figure out exactly what that thief Darth had taken from her house that wasn't found in the back of his truck. Plus, he had to be working with someone. Doreen would like to know who that was. She wanted to attend Darth's trial too. She trusted Mac to return the items they knew had been taken, but there could be so much more missing than she knew. So she sent Mac a text. Darth, what else did he steal from me? Who's he working with? When's his trial? Doreen had pocketed her phone to hear a beep almost instantly, pulling out her phone once more, surprised to get a response so fast from Mac. I'll let you know what I can let you know as we figure it out. Typical Mac. Finally, having worn herself down with all those thoughts, she stopped at a particularly shallow spot in the creek, where she kicked off her sandals and walked into the water. It was a beautiful sunny day, and if nothing else, it was lovely to be by the water and just listen to the delightful soothing sounds for a few moments. She found a particularly large flat rock and sat down, kicking the water, deliberately splashing Muggs, who danced around barking at her. Goliath sat on a high flat rock beside her. Thaddeus entertained himself and her by hopping from rock to rock. "You guys are allowed to play," she said, "but you're not allowed to find anything." "Why shouldn't they?" a man said from behind her. She turned to see Steve and frowned at him. "I'm surprised to see you here." His eyebrows rose. "Wow, and here everyone says you are friendly. I gather we got off on the wrong foot?" She shrugged. "You weren't terribly friendly yourself the last time I met you." "I'm sorry for that," he said, "but you were skulking around Penny's house. I do like to keep an eye out for her. She's a dear friend." Wondering if she had indeed behaved suspiciously at the time, Doreen admitted, "That makes sense, but you scared me." "Oh my goodness," he said, walking a few feet south of her and sitting down on a nearby rock, "I didn't mean to." Then he frowned, adding, "Well, maybe I did. I did think you were perhaps up to no good." His tone was light, and his mannerisms were so different than last time that she almost believed him. She had no reason not to believe him. She nodded and said, "Well, in that case, hi." He chuckled as he watched Thaddeus peck away at a piece of driftwood. "I don't think I've ever met anybody who went for walks with 3 pets like yours." "They like to go with me everywhere," she said warmly. "They certainly make my life interesting and fun." "I'm sure," he said in amazement. "And the cat?" "Goliath chooses to come with me," she explained. "He's a character, and he loves to watch the creek." "You can get him in the water?" he asked in surprise. "Oh gosh no, but he does love to sit here and enjoy the view with me, whereas Mug's here," she said, motioning toward her basset hound. "I don't think he's happy unless he is wet." And just then Muggs jumped farther into the creek, his ears floating on the surface as he barked, happily swimming. "You don't worry about him floating away." She shook her head. "He's a good swimmer. And we've spent lots of days playing in the creek." "I haven't seen you around here before," he said. "I'm from farther down the creek," she said. "We don't normally walk up this far. But this morning I just wanted to get out of the house." "The wall's crowding in on you?" "You could say that," she said with a wry smile. "Sometimes you just need a change." "You are Doreen, right?" She nodded. "Yes, I'm sure I told you that before." He just smiled. "You're wary now." "Why?" "Because I don't want to find out you're a reporter or something," she said. She looked at him, suddenly suspicious. "What do you do for a living?" He gave a bark of a laugh at that. "I'm a lawyer," he said. Instantly, she could feel herself withdrawing. "Oh." "And a wealth of emotion is in that exclamation," he said gently. "I suppose you don't like lawyers either." She wrinkled her face. "I'm sure some are okay." She hopped to her feet, gave him a bright smile, and said, "I really do need to head back though. It was nice meeting you again." She tried to make it sound like she wasn't running away, but when he laughed, she realized she'd failed. "I don't mean to be rude. But you just can't help running away." "I admit that I don't usually get that kind of a response when I tell people I'm a lawyer." "I'm going through a nasty divorce," she said. "My lawyer shafted me." He grinned amiably. "I'm a corporate lawyer," he said. "I don't handle divorces." "Understood," she said. "Besides, not all lawyers are the same, I'm sure." He chuckled and stood. "Anytime you want to go out and have coffee," he said, "I promise I'll prove to you that I'm not the same as every other lawyer." She smiled and said, "Maybe sometime. Thanks for the invite." And she turned and walked down the pathway. She deliberately didn't turn around, but she could feel his eyes boring into her back. She should have gotten his last name. Just Steve wouldn't cut it. And already she wondered if she could contact Mac about him. See if this guy was on the up and up or if he was a shyster, like her ex-lawyer was. But then why would Mac do that? It wasn't like he had the right to investigate people without cause, right? But if she had Steve's last name, she could do a lot herself. As she walked past Penny's, she wondered about asking Penny about Steve, then thought that was stupid. Still, Doreen pulled out her phone and sent Penny a text. "Hey, I just ran into your friend Steve on the creek. Interesting guy." Her response came back pretty quickly. "And he's single and wealthy," Penny texted. "You could do worse." At that response, Doreen replied, "I can't remember his last name. I know he's a lawyer, but I can't place him." "Albright," Penny texted. "He's a high-profile lawyer, does corporate stuff," she wrote. "He's a really nice guy." "Interesting," Doreen answered. "Thanks for the name. Now at least it'll stop bugging me." "No problem," Penny said. "Maybe you want to come over, and we can discuss my garden sometime." "Sure," she said. "I'm on the creek right now." "Come over then. I'll put on the tea kettle." With that firmly shifting her direction, Doreen backtracked on the easier rocks to get across the creek and headed toward Penny's house. She didn't know where Steve was now, and she dared not look. As she made it to the other side, she saw Steve heading toward Penny's too. He stopped, looked at her, and raised an eyebrow. Doreen shrugged. "I was talking to Penny. She invited me for tea." "Right," he said. "That's where I was going too." And he fell into step beside her. Although she felt a little awkward because she wanted to ask questions about him, there wasn't much she could do about it. As they approached Penny's house, Penny opened her front door and laughed. "And look at that. The two of you. Together. Come on in." But Steve just shook his head and said, "No, I've got to head into town. I was just walking her to your place. We'll talk later, Penny," and he gave a wave and took off. Doreen watched him leave, and as she turned back around, Penny's face twisted with bright curiosity. "Well, you're definitely interested," she said in delight. "He's a good man." "Maybe," Doreen said with a smile. "But the fact that he's a lawyer isn't in his favor." At that, Penny laughed. "Maybe," she said, "but he doesn't do the kind of work that most of us would think." "Maybe," Doreen said, "but still. So what's this about your garden? Have you made some decisions about what you want to do?" "Your idea for a memorial is lovely," she said warmly. "And I have signed the contract with the realtor to sell the house." "Oh, interesting," Doreen said in surprise. "That was fast." "Yes, I'll probably head back east, closer to my daughters, find a condo near them," she said, "but I'll see." "When's the sign going out?" Doreen asked, turning to look around. "I think in 2 days. They need a contractor to install the sign. And we've got a photo session coming up." "Did you ask about having the house staged?" "She only said if I wanted to, I could." "What about the clutter?" Penny shook her head. She didn't seem to think that was a problem. Inside, Doreen frowned. "Interesting," she said cautiously. "From everything I've read and heard, a house sells better when it's sparsely furnished, so it shows lots of space and lots of room for the new buyer's own possessions." "Maybe," Penny said, "but at the moment I'm good with this. Hopefully somebody will offer close to full price, and I'll get to leave real fast." Thinking her friend was probably dreaming on all accounts but not knowing for sure, Doreen just smiled. They took their tea outside to the back garden and continued their discussion of all kinds of options, from buying new plants to just rearranging some. "And you're okay to have the memorial here, even though you're selling, correct?" "I'm leaving this stage of my life behind, and I'm leaving them both behind, so?" She shrugged. "That seems like a fair thing to do. Do you want to plant a small bush or more flowers? What are you thinking of?" Penny pointed out the edging around the Echinacea. "Those are stamped bricks. You can't really see it from here because the plants are so overgrown, but I thought maybe I'd do something in this really rough spot here and maybe put a small tree, a weeping or red maple or something," she said. Then she gave a half laugh. The weeping part is probably apropos. Absolutely, Doreen said. She walked over to the Echinacea, happy to have a chance to take a good look with Penny here, and bent down to pull out one of those stamped bricks Penny had mentioned. These are quite pretty. If you hose them off and took a steel scrub brush to them, they'd clean up nicely. Maybe, Penny said, but that sounds like an awful lot of work. I won't have much time because we'll have the realtor showings coming up fast. That's true, Doreen said. And remember, regardless of what you do, the new buyer could rip it all out. Penny nodded. But I'm doing this for me, she said firmly. Good enough, Doreen said. She stood and stepped back. You should have fun with this project. Actually, Penny hesitated. I was wondering if I could hire you to do it. Doreen looked at her in surprise and delight. Pay me to do what exactly? I don't have a lot of money, Penny said, but I was thinking for a couple $100 you might be able to do something nice. Doreen schooled her expression to not show the joy she felt screaming inside her. When would you want it done? She asked cautiously. The sooner, the better. I was thinking the backyard if that's where you think it should be, although there is that unfinished bed in the front. Let's walk out there and take a look. Doreen walked past the Echinacea and said, Do you just want a tree or do you want to move some of these plants out there too? I'm not sure. I'm at a loss now. I thought I knew what I was talking about when you first came out, but now it seems I have more options than I first considered. No problem, Doreen said. I can definitely help you come up with something nice. But if we make it too complicated, it will take more time. No, she said. I definitely don't want to make it complicated then. In the front yard was a round garden with a very sad-looking bunch of flowers. Why don't you take that little weeping maple in the back in the center and move it up here? Doreen said. Although I don't know, are you planning to put something like a little rock or stone or bury something to show it as a memorial? Penny shook her head. No, this is literally just for me, but this bed is looking pretty sad, and for curb appeal, I suppose it would be the best place for this to happen. Doreen thought about it and said, It's pretty crowded where the maple currently is. It would make a better statement here. If you want, I can make sure the soil here is decent first before we transplant that tree. Then I could move the stamped bricks from the backyard to create an edging look. I thought George put some around this front bed. They must be covered up. That's one less thing to move then, Doreen said, smiling. Penny looked thrilled. And you can do it soon? I can't start today, Doreen said. The moving men are in my house packing up the antiques. That's one of the reasons I came out for a walk. To get away from all the chaos. Penny nodded. They can be quite disruptive, can't they? Absolutely. I could probably stop by tomorrow and get started. Do you have shovels I can dig with? Penny nodded. You know what, I do. There are lots of gardening tools around. If you have anything like that which you want me to put in, Doreen said, why don't you bring it out when I start digging, and I can figure out what should go where and maybe create something George would have liked. This is sounding better and better, Penny said, clapping her hands. George always thought this whole bed should be redone, but I never really knew what to do with it, because nothing seemed to grow well. I can handle that, Doreen said confidently. Collect all the stuff you think George wanted to plant here, and it'll just be George's bed. Thank you, Penny said. I guess I'd like to make it George's and Johnny's bed. If you have a rock you want to paint something on, then do so, she said. Maybe take a couple flat rocks and, with a permanent marker, write their names or their initials, something to memorialize them. Put down all 3 of your names because you're leaving. Once you sell the house, you'll be part of the memorial, she suggested. Penny looked intrigued with the idea. That's not a bad idea either. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow morning then, she said as her phone rang. I have to go inside and take this. Nodding, Doreen handed Penny the teacup, called the animals to her, and waited until Penny had dashed inside the house. Doreen stood here for a few long moments, studying the bed. It had dead grass in the front, which meant it wasn't getting water on a steady basis. She should have asked Penny if any underground irrigation was here, because that would make a big difference too. She moved a couple of the rough rocks sitting on top. This would be hard work. Something she hadn't really understood before she had said she'd do this job. Although it would be a lot of work, it was also a lot of money for her. Not only that, it was her second gardening job. Feeling lighter and happier, she called the animals back out to the creek, and they headed home.